Welcome to our 8th Symposia session on effectively managing internal relationships. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone to please mute their mics when they're not speaking. Feel free to use the chat to submit additional questions throughout the presentation. Our speaker today is Eric Green. Eric is Executive Vice President, Head of Tax for Fidelity Investment. In this role, Mr. Green leads and manages the firm's global tax function. Tony has worked with Eric for over 2 decades, and he's one of the top global tax leaders in the country. Eric does a tremendous job of positioning the tax department within the cross-functional groups at the C-suite level. On that note, I'll hand it off to Gareth, who has a few housekeeping items to share.
Thank you, Meg. Before I hand it over to Eric, I'm going to go over just a couple of points with everyone. And the first is, I know time's flown by since we started the first session of Symposia. And after today's session, we only have 2 more sessions left. So the next one is going to be July 11th. We're going to have Tim McDonald from Procter & Gamble, who's going to be teaching that session. And that one is going to be on effectively managing external relationships. And then that will be followed by our very last session, which will be in August. And the subject on that one is all going to be about branding. Secondly, it's been amazing to see how many talented tax professionals we've had come together on this symposium process. So we really appreciate you guys joining us. We know there's always things that we can change or improve, and we need your help in doing so going forward. We are going to be sending everyone a survey asking you guys how we could make things even better, what could be improved, what didn't go so well, what you guys would like to see more of. So be on the lookout for that survey and be as honest as you can. Let us know kind of what worked, what didn't work. So we'd really appreciate your feedback. And this is going to go on to help in my next point. We are going to be hosting a next symposium round. And this will be kicking off in August sometimes. And this is going to be a chance for you guys to give back as well. You guys have had the opportunity to go through this program, and it's been a great opportunity to do so. But now you get to think about who you should be inviting for the next round of Symposia. Who are some of the people you guys hold in high regard and who would benefit from this program? We really appreciate some of you have already reached out with names for us, so that's been awesome. We're actually going to be closing out the session over the next few weeks because of how full the names are getting already. So if there is anyone that you think of and you want to add them to the list, please let us know as soon as possible. But also if you have anyone in mind that you think, hey, maybe they're a year or 2 away from where this would be really beneficial for them, still let us know. We have several individuals that are already on our wait list for kind of 2019 and beyond. So be thinking about who you'd like to invite. And then lastly, I think we've been very fortunate to have some great speakers who have taught some of these sessions so far. As we move forward with the next round of Symposia classes, we'd love to have some of you guys join in and help with some of the teaching as well. So if you're interested and enthusiastic about teaching and would like to do so in the next round, then definitely let us know. We will send out a list of the topics covered so you can actually put in order which one you'd be interested in teaching. Perhaps give us what your top 5 choices would be. So that's my housekeeping for today. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to pass over the reins to Eric Green.
Great. Thanks, Gareth. When Tony asked me to speak on this topic, I thought, well, isn't a lot of this just common sense, which I think other people may have the same reaction. So I was putting together the slides, and I think some of it is common sense. A lot of it, though, given that we're tax people and not organization or human behavior experts, we may think it's common sense, but there are quite a few things that we need to keep in mind and keep reminding ourselves as you look at what makes you successful on navigating corporate organizations and general. I just want to note that I'm going to be speaking a lot from past experience here. I'm not necessarily going to be speaking about Fidelity. We tend to be we are privately held and a somewhat private company as far as what we communicate, but I'm happy to chime in with examples over the last 30 years of experience that I've had. This tends to be a very kludgy area. It's going to depend on your company culture. It's going to depend on personalities. Things that may have worked for me in the past or behaviors that I've seen over the course of a number of different companies may be completely different for you. So just keep that in mind as I talk here. And please feel free to submit questions, stop me. anything that comes to mind. I'm going to break it up. As I was putting together some notes, I was thinking about the different kinds of internal relationships that you need to navigate. I'm going to break it up based on kind of your team in general, your direct reports, which can be a handful to manage, because managing the kind of people that you want to have as your direct reports can give you a challenge. You want to have very bright, ambitious people reporting to you, and that in itself can be a management issue. How do you break down silos? I think you need silos to some degree. People need to know what they're responsible for, but you have to constantly strive to break them down, and there's going to be a fair amount of resistance as we try and do that. I'm going to talk about collaboration across the organization. Often you're going to have other colleagues that may not want to be as collaborative as you, and they may feel the same about you. But when I think about your key collaborators, it's going to be a combination of tax, treasury, legal, controllers, financial planning. If you can manage it, that can be quite the juggernaut to help accomplish quite a bit within the company. And if not, it could sink you. And then we'll talk a bit about communicating up, managing upwards to not only CFO or the general counsel or other people considered within the sphere of your boss, but up to the board and the audit committee, and how to create allies in senior management. And then last, I'll talk about some personal behaviors and other miscellaneous and just things I've learned over 30 years. So I think with that, start with your team. I can tell you when I've taken over a new tax role across the board, the first thing I do is I meet one-on-one with every team member. That might be different if you're actually building and hiring up a team, but or if you've been in place for a long time. But I think no matter what, if you are new to the role, it's great to actually start dialogue with every member of the team, no matter how far down you go. Also helps you to then convince them that you are sincere about maintaining an open door policy, so that they will feel free to come in and talk to you. I found that people don't come in and try and talk your ear off about things. Some might, but most just appreciate knowing that you're there to listen. You've established that rapport from the beginning of saying, I care to understand what you're working on. What are your hopes for the future? Do you want to stay within the group? Do you want to move in different parts of the group? It at least begins the dialogue. Once you've done that, you should probably start regular skip level meetings for those, certainly those reporting into your direct reports, and sometimes a little farther down. I found your direct reports can sometimes be threatened by the fact that you are starting skip level discussions. There is a certain amount of paranoia, I think, that sometimes occurs. So one of the best ways to get around that is to encourage your direct reports to do the same. Make it part of your group's culture of an environment where you regularly reach out to others within the organization at different levels, and a lot of that can be career development. People like hearing about what's worked for you. They may express concerns about others in the organization, which is always helpful to know. And you need to be not necessarily standoffish, but very objective about it. It does become easy to see where others are trying to manipulate. I don't mean to be negative, but as you do this, you always have to be mindful of the fact that you may have people who think they're smarter than you, and they think they can plant the seeds of discord. But mostly, people take it in a very positive way. I think they want to be heard. They want to know something about you. It's great when you learn about them. I think as you do this and you learn about people in the department, pretty important to know personal facts about people. Spouses' names, where do they live, approximate ages of their kids, things that are going on. Do they have a bad commute? What are their outside interests? Now, if you have a large department, obviously that's really hard to do, but it pays off dividends. I remember I was at Accenture, and I was working pretty closely with an attorney, and this was many years ago in my career, and the general counsel stopped by, and he asked this person I was working with how his wife was by name. And he was just so impressed by the fact that the general counsel knew his wife's name. You know, he had met her at a Christmas party or something, but it's the kind of thing that goes a long way. You know, easier to do in a smaller group, harder in a large group, but you know, even more appreciated, I think. And overall, you know, encourage dialogue. Sometimes when you have the skip level reporting and things may emerge, certain themes or facts about one of your direct reports, you have to be absolutely certain as you handle that there's no hint of retaliation that occurs at all. You know, you're dealing with a lot of different personalities and behaviors and people that may feel threatened. So it's another challenge. But you know, overall, I think if you keep doing it, persevere, it pays dividends. And I think overall, it's really the tone at the top. What tone are you setting within the group? You know, your behaviors are watched by everyone in the group. And when it comes down to communication, integrity, we'll talk about collaboration in a bit. You know, if you're seen to be aloof, standoffish, you know, then people are not going to be open to believing that you really want to create one large tax team, for example. One thing I will share, when I got here to Fidelity, based on some people who had been in the roles before and their behaviors, where they actually created silos and favorites and basically create a lot of work for people where they didn't have to. No one really understood what it was like to work as one tax team. So something we did is we brought in some outside help, but we created tax norms for the group. You know, not just the mission and the vision, but what were the day-to-day rules that we're going to live by. And then, you know, we had to make sure that certainly everyone in leadership understood them and lived by them. And it was just surprising to me that a lot of people didn't even understand that, look, at the end of the day, you may be in planning and trying to push your planning agenda, and you may be in compliance, but if you're not talking to each other, the one that suffers is the head of tax, right? And you know, I made it clear to them at the end of the day, you know, the success of the department can be reflected if, you know, the head of tax knows what's going on across the board, as opposed to people who are infighting and winding up with it looking like you can't even control your own group. So the fact that you even have to strive for one tax team is not unusual, but sometimes to put it in the context of, hey, you're helping me to succeed and the group to succeed, resonates with people who are otherwise simply looking at various groups and infighting. So with that said, getting to the direct reports, I think you often have clashes due to personalities. I mean, everyone's human. Territoriality, as I mentioned before, ambition. And that's your job to manage that. It's your job to figure out what makes your various direct reports tick. You know, some may need a lot more caring and feeding than others. Some may be hesitant to come in and talk to you, and you need to really work on that with them to make sure that, you know, they can come to you with anything. So the last thing you want to do is kind of blow up the handle, go with the handle, blow up. You know, the sky never falls. It is just tax at the end of the day. So to get people comfortable, to make sure that they can elevate any issue, that they can get your guidance, it becomes a very human nature kind of discussion, I think. And I think even senior people start to often fail to see the benefits of being collaborative and helping others to succeed. They may get too tied up in their own success, kind of a me first. Often happens with, I found people in tax planning who feel like they might be more important than other members of the organization. So you have to bend over backwards sometimes to make sure that you're not neglecting compliance or provision, which because everyone knows will come back to bite you pretty hard if you're not putting the appropriate resources into compliance and provision. It's hard to avoid appearing to favor any one over another. There are going to be some direct reports you just have a natural rapport with. So there's another conscious effort you're going to need to do. And there are some direct reports that someone once described it as running to daddy syndrome. They really just want to always come into your office and tell you what's going on, and then you have other direct reports who are going to say, well, so-and-so is a favorite, you're always talking to them. So I just find you always have to be mindful of the appearance and maybe make the extra effort of walking into some of your direct reports offices if they're not running into yours. I think the other thing you always have to look out for, though, is when you really do have destructive behaviors among some of your direct reports. Sometimes you don't want to see it. Sometimes it's a lot easier because they're doing good work. And that's also where having the skip levels pays dividends, because you'll hear about how some of your direct reports are perceived across the organization. And in that case, once you're certain that there is a problem, don't hesitate to take action. It may be very difficult, it may be hard for you, it may create a hole in the organization, but if it turns out that you have a bad apple, sometimes you just can't work around it. It might be just a personality issue, and you're going to have to do something. You're going to have to merge roles. You're going to have to reassign some responsibilities. You may have to walk them out the door, but not to be too negative. Just be mindful of that as well. So I know that I'm kind of going stream of consciousness here, but Meg, I'm not sure if we had any questions based on teaming and overall team and direct reports.
Hey, Eric, I wanted to just throw one thing out there, just in case anyone wasn't too familiar with one of the things that you mentioned. You spoke about skip level meetings. For those people maybe not as familiar with that, could you just kind of elaborate on what that looks like a little bit?
Sure. So you should look at the next level down below your direct reports and rotate through. Pick a number of schedule a number of meetings with a few of them, one-on-one. You can go to lunch, you can have coffee. Sometimes that's a little easier than having them just come in and sit and chat in your office at first. And the idea is to give them an idea of what your vision is for the department. Let them understand more of your history and your career development. Hear about what they would like to do in the future, and then start to get their views of what it's like to work with others in the department or across the company. And then you can get an idea of where you can help.
Will you, at that point, if you've spoken to that individual, would you then go back to who their direct supervisor is and kind of talk about what you guys have seen, or does it stay kind of more between you and that individual?
It stays between you and that individual until you start to hear a number of consistent themes that you may need to coach your direct reports on, or there may be something directly that occurs to you. But you want to do it without saying so-and-so said. You want to do it in the context of coaching your direct reports based on just the feelings and information you've heard from those who report into them. And then you can go further down the organization as well, right? You can do double skip up.
Eric, this is Sarah Rana. I wanted to ask you a question about succession planning and dealing with members of your team who are at different stages in their career. So I have a direct report that's quite seasoned, and I think for a long time didn't really think about succession planning because he never sort of thought about the end of his career. And now, how do you manage, when succession planning becomes less of a concept and more of a reality? And do you have any suggestions on how to work with people through that phase of their career where they haven't picked an end date, but everybody knows it's coming within the next 2 to 5 years, and how you deal with, when that person isn't sort of ready to face it? It's kind of a dicey HR issue, but it's like it could create a potentially big gap for the department.
I do it by making succession planning a normal part of the annual review process, by engaging a number of different levels. So I encourage it at my direct report level so that they can have the succession planning talks within their groups. And then we roll it up to the group with my direct reports so that it's not focused on any one individual. It's looking at each of the major roles and then identifying several individuals in the group who could potentially move up into those roles. So instead of making it something that's more personal and immediate, talking about it across all the various roles, and then, focusing it on, well, who's ready now, ready in 1 to 3 years, ready in 3+, and also then what else do we have to do for some of those people that we've identified to make sure that they have the career development. So instead of focusing it on one individual who may be closer to retirement without realizing it, really focus it on the group as a whole, has been my experience, and make it part of the annual process.
And do you usually include like HR? So the company that I work for, our HR processes aren't quite that sophisticated. So our annual review process is really just a review. It's not centered around competencies. It's not focused on career development as much. So, I mean, I can work with my HR business partner to see, would you suggest involving HR throughout the process there, just given some of the sensitivities around, because nobody's ever really done it here, and it's becoming more of an issue now, now that I've been here for a couple of years. Do you think it makes sense to involve HR, I guess, given the...
Yeah, I would involve HR, and I would do it in the context of now introducing a formal process, really, as part of your annual process of saying, hey, we want to actually, as part of this, it's not just succession planning, it's career development. So you're identifying kind of the higher performers that might be able to move into other roles within the department, and then you start playing the chess game because then someone else needs to move to their role. But I would definitely involve HR, but have it as a discussion among the tax people with an HR person present.
Thanks. That's helpful. Thank you.
I see there's a question. When you come into a tax department from the outside as a new VP of tax, how do you deal with the people inside the tax department that expected to be VP of tax but didn't get it? Very careful. You normally need those people, right? Often it's going to be someone who is a little more junior and not ready for the role. Often it's someone who might be a VP of planning, for example, and you definitely need their expertise. So, and my experience has been, making them an ally as soon as you can, and letting them understand that you're there for their career development as well. One advantage for me is I have moved around quite a bit. So I always say, there's no guarantee I'm going to be here for many, many years. And my goal is to make sure that when I leave, I have a successor. And so you're kind of co-opting and bringing the person that hoped to be VP of tax on board to understand that the door is still not closed, right? That there was a reason the person was not VP of tax, and it could be many. I mean, if it's a personality issue, that's something else. If it's because they were too junior, that's a little easier, because then you can really work with them and explain and show them what it means to be a head of tax. Because often the person that was passed over doesn't understand how to develop people as well, doesn't understand the need for collaboration, doesn't understand how to communicate up. And those are things that they can certainly learn one-on-one from you.
Eric, have there been any kind of cases where maybe you've had situations where employees are, say, gunning for the same position within your team, and it causes some kind of maybe hostile environment or some kind of bad atmosphere? And if so, kind of how would you handle a situation like that?
In that situation, you have to be really careful. If it reaches a point where someone is just so upset that someone else got a promotion, or they did, or they're moved into a role, and they're going to start undermining. You be upfront, you talk with the people, but at some point there, you actually may have to make a decision that someone needs to go. It depends on how bad they're acting within the group. But I find most people will look at why didn't they get a certain role, and what could they do better to get it, and what is it that they're lacking. Once again, it's always depends on human nature and different personalities. But I would say, don't hesitate after you've given people a lot of chance to be part of the team. If you have a more senior person who's acting badly, don't hesitate to take action on it.
Perfect. Thank you.
I don't mean to be negative there. I just think you, as the head of tax, you always have to be mindful that you're setting the example, and you can't have people that are going to undermine what you're trying to create in the department. And sometimes nothing succeeds as well as a public hanging. So I'm breaking down the silos. I think this is one of the hardest things to do within a tax department, because the work just lends itself to being siloed. And I think, as I mentioned, you're going to create it because you're going to have people who are definitely responsible for certain parts of the work. But what I find often happens is then people are very territorial, and they want to completely own it, and they want to be the ones who get all the credit for it. So you have to be pretty proactive with that, making sure all your direct reports understand that unless everyone's working together, it doesn't really matter. The fact that you've done it collaboratively with others doesn't mean you're not going to get all the credit. Often this comes down to planning people just saying, this is my idea. I did all the work on this. I want the credit. And it takes some doing to get them to understand that there are a lot of other viewpoints on a particular project, and they're going to get even more credit if they can be more collaborative about it. And that will help to break down the silos, but it's really hard to do. One thing I've always done is I've made sure that that I look at who's invited to certain meetings, especially if I'm being debriefed, and I insist that other members of different groups, whether it's compliance or provision, be in the meeting as well. I walk into meetings where planning may be presenting something to me, and there's no one there from provision or audit or compliance, and so I don't even take the meeting. I end the meeting and reschedule it. So I'm relentless in making sure. It took me a long time to get here, but I'm relentless in making sure that there's a fair cross-section of who should be in the various meetings. Now, you don't want to do that in every meeting. You're going to need to have meetings where you have just planning or just compliance or provision, but it'll be pretty obvious to you where you can take the opportunity to make sure your people understand that you're displeased when they haven't included the right people to be in the meeting. And then have private conversations with your leads and explain to them that your philosophy and the way you operate is that you need everyone in the room certainly when it's the end of a project and you're being presented. But I find along the way, when you're having working sessions, to make sure that the various relevant groups are in the room. I think more often than not, I have people from compliance and to some extent provision who just complain, rightfully, that they're not included in certain meetings. And it's your job, by example, then, to actually go in and say, this is what I mean by breaking down the silos and having those cross-group meetings. It doesn't help that many heads of tax have come up through tax planning. I think as you become a head of tax and you deal so much with compliance and provision, and often the book impact becomes the most important as you're communicating up, it starts to become just a lot more evident to you about who needs to be in the room. At least, for me, it became far more evident than it ever was when I was head of tax planning at various organizations. The other tool I found really successful, more so here now at Fidelity, we use it quite a bit as opposed to other organizations along the way, and you need to involve HR in this, is the use of 360s. And a lot of people may moan because it takes a fair amount of input to complete 360 and the questions that are asked. But when you debrief on a 360 and you actually talk about behaviors and what people could be doing differently and how they're viewed by others, it creates a pretty powerful message. You have to be careful not to do them too often, because then people will have 360 fatigue. As we all know, everyone's pretty busy. But I think certainly for your direct reports and certain high potential people who you're going to consider for succession planning, the 360 makes a lot of sense. And for those who haven't done them, there are a number of various programs out there that different HR departments use. And you identify colleagues as well as people that work for you, people you work for, and they're geared towards a number of different questions about behaviors and how you interact. And the results can often be very surprising. It's all of the input comes back without identifying anybody. It's all completely anonymous, but I found it's been really helpful. Do we have any questions on that before I move on to collaboration and how to work with others across the organization?
Oh, I think that was it.
Great. So I think that the next area is, how do you collaborate across the organization with key allies? Or how do you identify who your key allies are in an organization? And for me, the natural allies have always been Treasury, legal, controllers, and to some extent financial planning and analysis, if you have that kind of group. And I guess I would start off by saying, you may think, yeah, well, I'm pretty collaborative. I work with those guys. We get along well. And I'm just here to say you're probably not as collaborative as you think. Unless you're really in those people's offices every day, if you're not scheduling meetings with them to actually share what you're working on, you're not collaborative enough. And often there's a feeling that, well, I'm working on the tax part of things. I'm going to work through this, and I'll go and talk to legal and accounting and others when I really worked it through. And I found in a lot of organizations, it really helps when you keep them informed of everything as you're working through it, even having working sessions with those people. It's hard to do, but if you actually make those groups as appropriate part of your decision-making process, they'll understand that you're still working through these issues. But they're going to really enjoy being part of it, and they're going to bring up points that you don't know or couldn't know because it's outside the group. And you may be thinking about something and have forgotten that there may be a legal restriction out there on what you're thinking about doing. For book purposes, it's great for your accountants and controllers to start thinking about, well, what would both the GAAP or the non-GAAP position be on that? The more you get your colleagues to feel like they're part of this process and that there are no surprises, I just find the better off you are. An example here is we have a phenomenal treasury group that, they're all super smart MBAs who know how to make a spreadsheet sing. So whereas in the past, I would have had my group do a lot of tax modeling, here we have the treasury group running our models, and they love doing it. They love being part of it. And obviously we have to tell them, what are the tax rules and how to design it, but they are so far better than anyone in my group on running the models that we end up, we call them the tax treasury models, and it makes my job a lot easier. We were on a project recently, and one of the treasury people, as a result of succession planning, actually moved out into the business. And she said her only regret was she couldn't stay and see the tax project through, which I thought was a great endorsement of operating like that. Your colleagues may not and probably won't treat you the same. So just keep erring on the side of inclusion, creating the regular updates, including them where possible, especially on, obviously M&A projects are going to be working across the board. I found that on M&A, you have to be such a part of a team across the board, and you don't want to be hiding any information or waiting. You may not even think you're hiding it. You may just think, I want to really figure this out before I share it. It really helps just to tell people that are trying to run the larger M&A deal that you're thinking about this and working on it, and keeping them informed about it. So, communicate early and communicate often. Don't get upset, as I said, if they don't return the favor. Keep at it. It's really going to help you if you're viewed as the one to be inclusive. I've been at different companies where I was not viewed as the one being inclusive. I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was doing it great, but I was really just trying to do it too much, almost like tax on an island, and then going out and building the book afterwards when I had everything completely worked through and done. And that's really not a great way to operate. It's maybe a natural way of how we would operate, but getting the groups involved in your projects earlier rather than later just really helps. It also helps when something comes up and there's a nasty surprise about something. Because everyone feels like, okay, they've been part of this inclusive process. There's no finger pointing. It really becomes more, how are you going to work this out? Sometimes it's going to upset people in your group. It's going to upset some of your direct reports. I was at a prior company. We had a material weakness and had an enormous tax basis balance sheet project to work through. My VP of tax reporting rightfully thought that he should be the one to run it. But it became fairly clear that one of the assistant controllers really should run it. And so I had to manage his reaction to it and actually help him understand that he was only going to be reporting to the assistant controller on it. But there was no way that we were going to be able to get that project done the way we did, and with the support of our auditors and getting them comfortable, if that VP of reporting had run it. So, it's a relationship challenge on many sides, but at the end of the day, you're going to be better off for it because it's going to be easier on you, and you'll get to the right answer. I think as you collaborate across the organization, you really have to be mindful of personalities and where do you choose your battles. Choose them carefully. I've seen too many people take tax way too seriously. I mean, it is serious what we do. It's a lot of money at the end of the day, and it is our careers. On the other hand, there are a lot of people in the company, and these people in particular that you're working with, who also feel quite committed to what they're doing and their jobs and their careers, and they have strong feelings. I saw earlier on, the chief tax officer constantly battle the chief accounting officer because he didn't agree with some of his judgments about deferreds. All that did was to create a horrible environment for everyone in both departments because it was a constant battle. You set the tone at the top, it worked down through the entire organization, and chief accounting officer was always going to win. He's the one responsible for the book. So it was an awful lot of stress and battle for nothing at the end of the day. So you don't want to just give in. You want to stick to your guns. But in some ways, tax lends itself to doing it without a lot of drama because you can let the numbers speak for themselves. You can present all the pros and cons, the risks. Have it well thought out, have involved everybody. There might be some non-tax reasons that something's not going to happen. But, you should strive for when you have to elevate something to another decision maker, like the CFO or the board or the audit committee, and explain that you're comfortable with something from a tax perspective. Others might disagree. There are countervailing considerations. At least go up and make sure as you elevate that you're unified, that everyone agrees what the pros and the cons are. So, the chief accounting officer, the treasurer, whether it's the general counsel or the company secretary or head of corporate, that everyone knows what the pros and cons are. Don't go up and present something to the CFO, the CEO, to the board, and have any disagreement even about what the pros and cons are, because then you'll be dead in the water. But you'll be seen as a great team player if you've helped work through with everybody to get to one point of saying, okay, we can't agree on the course of action, but we agree on what the positives and negatives are. I've had groups of people where then someone uses that opportunity for self-promotion, and that never plays out well. I did have that experience with someone once, and it was kind of funny. They did it one too many times to the point where the CFO just completely called them out on it and humiliated them in front of the whole group, which was actually just a wonderful moment. But it just, we're working for smart people. They're going to see those behaviors. So don't get too upset about it. It will eventually happen. And just keep on plugging away and keep on being the one to be the collaborative one. I think one other area that served me well, and I know I've talked a lot about chief accounting officer and what happens with the books, but at a prior company, I would always err on the side of communicating early with the chief accounting officer, much to the chagrin of some of my direct reports, because they wanted to be able to work through an issue that had been spotted before we communicated it to anybody. But I found that if you go and tell the person that's responsible for the books that, hey, we have an issue, we're looking at it, we're going to see what happens, they're going to have a lot of trust in you. They're going to say you're not hiding anything, you're completely above board. Gives them a chance to get involved in the process. You may have someone who doesn't act that way, who reacts by saying, "Oh my God, what's going to happen?" But I think you're even in that situation, you're better off keeping them involved early and working it through. I've seen too many cases where really quite innocently a tax professional is trying to work it through before they go to anybody, and then you're accused of hiding the ball. So my advice is communicate early, often, explain what you're working on and how it might impact some of your colleagues. If you're working on larger projects, get them involved as much as you can. And I would just add one point about I know you're talking more about external communications in a different one, but in a way, this is almost internal. Is how do you collaborate with your advisors? Whether it's accounting firms or law firms, this goes back to the everyone is human point. You're paying them. Maybe you're a big client of theirs. You rightfully expect that they're going to do a good job for you no matter what. They are going to make mistakes. Hopefully they'll explain right away. It's never that pleasant when someone you've been relying for advice comes in and says, well, there was something they missed, but it will happen. How you react is going to have a big impact on them. I had one of the senior partners at one of the firms said to me, you're going to get companies that have interesting work. They're going to be important clients. They pay their bills on time. And then you have those that are actually nice. They're appreciative. They don't fly off the handle. And he said, it's almost impossible to find all four. He said, you're always going to have interesting work and important clients. You can have many that will also pay their bills. But to get the ones that are actually appreciative and you can have the conversations with, from a supplier perspective, from the accounting and law firm perspective, they're still going to do the work for you, no matter, if you call them out on things, which you should, if it's appropriate. But if you overreact, it's not like they're not going to do the work for you, but they may hesitate to take your call on a weekend or go the extra mile. And so I think just always keeping in mind that you're collaborating with them as well, that although you're paying them and they are your advisor, they are also a supplier in a sense, and you need to make sure your supply chain is working well. Okay. I don't know if there are any questions on that.
Yep, we have one question that came in. How do you collaborate with the IT department with the technology that is needed in the tax department? As a VP of tax, how deep do you feel like you need to understand the technology used within the tax department?
I think certainly today's times, very. It was also one of the first things I did when I got here was I commissioned kind of a tax technology study because it had been ignored. I think people often find tax technology is often ignored and not appropriately funded, or has not been appropriately funded over the years. Systems obviously often end up pre-tax. I've worked at companies where you spend half your time just trying to track down the data. I think environments have changed a bit, and I think technology groups now tend to understand that there is a need for specific support in the tax area. Before they thought, okay, well, we got your computers, we supported you on corp tax, what more do you need? So I found it very helpful to one, establish a rapport with whoever your head of technology is. Make sure as you're across, I think most companies have senior management meetings where you have social hours, go talk to the head of technology, be friendly, express an interest in what they do, explain what some of your needs are. And then, I've been lucky in that you often then get people within the technology group who are assigned to tax. And if not, you should request that. And then, talk to them about how the budgeting process works. Normally you can make the case to your boss about how you can get some dollars for that. Interestingly, I worked at companies where you define the needs within the tax group, but then it's actually funded out of a technology budget, in which case you have to really work extra hard with both the head of technology and the CFO to make sure that those needs are actually included in the final technology budget, that they don't get cut somewhere along the way. So I think it's really focused on making sure that you have people from your technology group who are assigned, who can appropriately support you, and then work with them to really define your needs, and leverage off of things that have been done with other groups in the organization. So we're doing that here. After we did the tax technology study, we had a number of people from technology assigned to us. We got the budget for it. And now we're working with them and an outside provider to actually define what we can do, what we can leverage from other financial systems we have, and what needs to get built in order for some of the solutions that we're looking for.
Right. We had one more question come in. What has been the most difficult situation you have found yourself in when it comes to dealing with cross-functional peers? How did you deal with it?
There have been so many. I think one of the most difficult was when I had a peer who would not. Two things happen. One, in my view, he was not stepping up to what he had to do on a large transaction, and it was falling to my people to actually do corporate legal work, which, at the end of the day, we could do some of it, but it really wasn't our job. And then he wasn't permitting his people to work with us either. So it was a very difficult situation. It was an important transaction. It was someone who I liked, but who just wasn't getting involved and wasn't permitting his own people to get involved. And that's the kind of situation where you invite that person to the meetings. We were doing a number of things abroad. We would travel to the foreign location, and he still wouldn't really step up. Eventually you have to use your good relations with others. I had to go to the CFO and the general counsel, and eventually the CEO heard about it too, and basically, we got his butt kicked, and Ben understood that they had to, he and his team had to be more proactive. But it took that. I mean, that was hard to do. I mean, you're kind of telling on somebody. But I gave him every opportunity to step up. It wasn't happening. At some point, you have to just say, for the good of the company, you're going to have to maybe be the bad guy and go and talk to some of the superiors.
Move on to the next section.
Okay. So next is communicating up, and this is extraordinarily important. It comes down to how you're viewed, how your department is viewed. It has a knock-on effect of how you're going to get funding and budgeting. whether you're going to be a success or not. And so for many people who are first stepping into the head of tax role, they've probably never spoken to the board before or the audit committee, which may be taking a step back. That's as you're developing your people, you should be trying to push them and bring them into as many meetings as possible. Some heads of tax may view that as threatening because you're introducing the CEO and the boards and the audit committee to some talented people, but it only speaks well for you. It really, your people will love it. It gives them an opportunity. I would say I did not have enough of that coming up at a number of different companies. It wasn't until I was actually taking a role, my first role as head of tax, that I started to communicate with the audit committee and with the board. And it was in the context of material weakness, which really wasn't that pleasant, but at least it was one that was inherited. So it made it a little easier. But remember, when you're presenting to senior management and the board, you don't have to prove how smart you are. You don't have to show that you're tax technical. That's basically assumed. Otherwise, you wouldn't be there to begin with. So kind of put that in the back of your mind, that you're there to communicate to them, whether it's an update on what you've been working on. It might just be a quarterly update to the audit committee. Might be some big decisions to be made. When you're doing that, you'll succeed if you know that you're going in there to try to enable them to feel like they understand the issue without you getting technical and ever referring to a code section. That they need to have the ability to say that they've discussed the issue, that they've talked about the pros and the cons of the issue, that they know what the ramifications are, and that they're agreeing to a course of action. And that's a hard skill. You need to do that in a way that is in more kind of colloquial way of speaking. But just constantly put yourself in that other person's shoes. They're responsible for making this decision. It's your job to make sure that they can understand what you spent weeks or months working on, and you've gone down into section 350 whatever, little I2, but you're never going to quote that to them. That the big concepts they can deal with. I remember one of the best moments of feedback was when one of the board members at one of the companies I worked for, at the end of a pretty lengthy discussion that could have been tax technical, but was really kept at a level that the board members could deal with, said that was a great discussion. It really felt like they understood and could add value. And that's what they're there for. They're there for oversight. If it's a CEO, it's a different area where they're actually responsible for that decision, whereas the board providing the managerial oversight. But I just found to always keep that in mind. Keep it high level, but with enough detail to enable the discussion. Really never use a code section reference unless you absolutely have to. They may ask, but always be ready to talk about the level of due diligence you've done, who's been involved in the decision that you're talking about. And then there'll be other times where you're really just updating the board or senior management. One thing I've done and continue to do is I'm pretty shameless about relentlessly promoting my group. And I do it through talking about what we're bringing to the bottom line. I get joked here that I've said it enough that people refer to tax as a profit center, but you kind of don't want people saying that to the IRS or elsewhere. But within the company, the fact that you are bringing a lot, both between risk management and what you're bringing to the bottom line, resonates. It resonates with business people and your leadership. So constantly do a quarterly update. Tell them what you're working on. If you're not interacting with the CEO, make sure the CEO or the general counsel knows what you're doing, so they can tell. It also is helpful to say, okay, well, it's X amount of tax savings, but that translates. You need 7 times the revenue to get that amount of earnings. That also resonates with people. So I think that's part of the communicating up as well. Constantly bringing it to people's attention that you're adding value, real value. That comes down to dollars, whether it's dollars that you saved on the return or costs avoided or risks managed. Don't be afraid to be a self-promoter. I think the other thing to remember is you communicate up, in the immediate hierarchy, your boss has an awful lot to worry about, whether, you report to the CFO or someone else. They have a ton of people to manage. They have a lot of issues. The last thing they have to worry about is tax. So don't be someone that they view as a problem. I always strive really not to complain about anything as I talk with higher ups. I'm positive about everything, even if they're interpersonal relationship issues or workload issues, or I always want to make sure that my boss is very happy when he picks up the phone. It's me on the other end, or I walk into his office. It's as I said, they have enough to worry about. Don't be another one of their worries. I would say, as far as actually, maybe before we move off that, I don't know if there are any questions about communicating up and how do you frame issues for senior management and the board and make sure you're heard.
We had a question that came in earlier from the previous section. He had some technical difficulties, so I wanted to address it now. Many organizations are focused on management results rather than legal entity results. Typically, it's only the tax department that is concerned about legal entity results. How do you emphasize the importance of legal entity accounting to the organization when most of the organization is focused on management results?
I'd say the other allies that also are concerned about legal entity results, Treasury, legal, and hopefully in controllers. Hopefully you can use them as allies. I found that the key is explaining what you need the results for, and then just going back to what I was just talking about, the dollars that can be at stake. Not to mention the issues that you have if you don't have the right legal entity data for doing your compliance through the provision. So I do it through example of just saying, just focus on the management results. This is what you're missing. Now, that said, if the company's focused on management results and it's a pre-tax management result, you're probably not going to get some of the attention of heads of the business units, but you're certainly going to get the attention of the CFO, the CEO, and the audit committee when you talk about the sheer dollar numbers of savings.
All right, that was it for this section.
Great. So I guess just some other points, and this is going to fall into maybe a category of personal behavior. I would say, be respectful of your people's time. You'll remember that if you're a new tax director, you'll remember what it was like to have to get projects done, what was involved. But as you move up and have more experience, you tend to forget. So things like the presentations that your group will do to you, don't make them do PowerPoints, right? And that's a huge time suck. Encourage them to do informal briefings, conversations. You can follow up afterwards with the level of detail you want. I frequently ask how long something's going to take. I may want something, but it's really not worth the effort and my people's time. So you have to prioritize them. And I try to be seen as someone who's mindful of their time, because we do strive for work-life balance. I think this is true of most of the companies I've worked at. For some of the more detailed work, we'll rely on outside counsel to actually draft the memoranda. So my team will do a lot of work on it. They'll be working with outside counsel. We'll understand technical issues pretty deeply, but actually to sit down and draft a 10 or 20-page memoranda can take someone weeks. So then that's where we just turn to outside counsel and tell them to do it, and we review it. I think the other point from a personal behavior standpoint is strive to be the calming presence in the room, no matter where you are. If you're the one running around in a panic, everyone else is going to. even if you should pay. You know, if you're setting arbitrary deadlines, if you're flying off the handle, it's just going to create a really bad atmosphere. You know, as I said, the sky rarely falls. You can usually work through things. If you're the calming presence, your people will act accordingly. They won't be afraid to come in and tell you something. And then you can calmly figure out the way forward. But you may have a million things to do. But don't be that one running down the hall, running to a meeting. You know, be the calm individual, set the tone. And you know, regularly practice patience and gratitude. People are, you know, going to be under pressure. They're going to fly off the handle. They're going to, you know, lose it sometimes. They're going to vent. Just, you know, take it with a grain of salt. Be sure you can calm them down. Don't judge unless it happens all the time, and move on. I think your people appreciate you for that. I think, you know, as I was going through this and I was summing this up for myself, I was like, well, you know, reaction to a lot of this might be, well, maybe you're not being strong enough. I'm talking about collaborating and compromising and being the one to take the initiative on including others. And there are plenty of organizations where people don't do that and they're still successful. It just may not be that pleasant a place to work. I think my message is, well, you know what, you still stick to your guns. You make your point. You know, you're not being a cast for milquetoast about any of this. But you know, you do it in the context of letting the numbers speak for themselves. Talk about the tax risks, the cost, the benefits, the potential loss. You know, but then, you know, be the one who, that's the name of the book, that's helping everyone to get to yes. Right? It is an area where the numbers will be big. People will pay attention, but just make sure you're also including other points of view, that you're trying to unite your corporate colleagues and others, and you know, making sure that they don't have any surprises and that they feel they can rely on you, that you're going to be the one to consistently try to get to an answer that works for the company. One advantage to being in tax is that we are a specialty group, obviously. It permits us to take a step back in a lot of ways on a political standpoint. You know, I find within finance and other organizations, you have an awful lot of people jockeying to be the next CFO, and they're kind of trying to create little fiefdoms, and they're trying to create the power base that lets them get to be CFO. And we don't have to do that. You know, we can take a step back from politics and be viewed as the strategic advisor and the straight shooter. And for me, that's been especially rewarding when you have a CEO call you in and ask you something because they know you're going to give them an answer that's not really politically minded. And I think there's no higher compliment than when you're able to be viewed that way. I guess maybe two final points before we maybe end with any other questions. Consider internally interacting with areas that you might not. I think with tax reform happening most recently, most people interact with government affairs. When I was coming up through the ranks, tax often didn't interact a lot with government affairs. So if you don't, that's an area that you could really add value. Maybe you're at a company that hasn't done a lot of lobbying or legislative work. But you know, if you explain some of the tax positions and where you might add value and how you may want to lobby, and you know, the first time you start doing it's really kind of a lot of fun to go down to Capitol Hill. After that, it turns out to be a pain. But it is somewhere where you can add value and build bridges to an area of the company that you could have a direct impact on through legislative affairs. And the last point I'll leave you with before any other questions is on budgets. It doesn't really relate particularly to managing internal relationships, but just as kind of, you know, mentoring and sharing what I found over the years is, you know, budgets are obviously important. Everyone's paying an awful lot of attention to them. You're going to have to go over budget. They happen once in a while and they happen frequently. You're just going to be in a position where to get to the right tax answer, you're going to need the advice. You're going to go over budget. My advice is explain it to the CFO, but do what's right. People are not going to remember that you went over budget, but they're certainly going to remember if you screwed up. So just that in mind. Okay. Meg, do we have any other questions?
Yep, we had a couple questions that came in. The first one is, so the key to building relationships is communicating effectively. Can you comment on principles you've relied on to communicate at the right level of complexity for peers outside of tax and business groups?
Yeah, no, I always bring it back to myself and an area, if I can't explain myself in some ways and understand, let me take us back. So you have your people coming in and explaining something to you very technically. And then you spending a lot of time understanding it. Well, then I take a step back and say, okay, well, if I, really didn't understand much about tax, but I understood that there are a number of steps that have to be taken and there are pros and there are cons and decisions to be made, then I just practice it on myself and I say, well, how would I want to really understand this? So it's really, I guess it's a skill set you learn of taking a step back and just figuring out how do you explain something without ever getting too technical, and then understanding where are their pressure points. So what does a controller, chief accounting officer, what does he want to understand? Well, he wants to understand what are all the pros and cons of what the impact is on the books. The treasurer is going to want to understand what's the cash position or what are the rating agencies going to think. Right, legal wants to know what are the risk management areas. So I think it's really just knowing your audience and tailoring it.
Okay, the next question is, do you take the same type of collaborative approach with the IRS? We do, and it works very well.
Yeah, we're very open with the IRS. There are certain there are obviously things that they don't need to know, might be privileged, but we are very collaborative. From the moment that and I've done this with every organization, from the opening conference onwards of expressing, our interest in making sure they understand, one, what are the big issues that they should look at, what's on the return, and offering any presentation at all. And we bring in the outside advisors that might have worked on something. If it's an R&D credit, give them as much information as possible on tangible property, things that are concrete that they really can dive into. If you've done a spin transaction, let them, do a presentation on it, let them ask their questions. You're not going to share your opinions with them, but get to them to the point where they view you as collaborative and willing to provide as much information as you can.
And then last question is, are there any other books you recommend?
Not really. I'll give that some thought.
All right, and we had one more come in. When trying to develop relationships with business groups, before there's a logical reason and need to work closely together, how do you get them to be willing to invest the time to spend with you before there is the actual need?
I do it more on a social basis. So I take advantage of company functions. I also think it's true in every company. There are going to be some business people who are really interesting, fun people. Seek them out. Don't even talk about tax. Talk about their business or things that interest them. Create the personal relationship, because they're really not going to be that interested in tax or in hearing about it. They may be interested in you once they get to know you, but do it from a social perspective.
That was all the questions that were chatted in.
So I know we're coming up to the end of time here as well, so I want to be mindful of everyone's schedules. I think Tony wanted to close us off before we finish, Tony.
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you, Eric. Truly appreciate Eric putting the time into this. He has been up to his elbows, which we can't go into the details, but Fidelity's been very busy. I go back many decades with relationships with Eric, and he's been very humble about his background, what he's been exposed to. But Eric was involved when Accenture, many many, many years ago when Accenture went out there and converted to a publicly traded company from a flow through to a C Corp. Talking about developing the relationships in the minefield with the partners and getting them on board with all of this. It was an amazing, amazing task, and he took up the global head of planning role for that at the time. He also was at the forefront of the complete rebuilding of Tyco's tax department. He was the first person hired externally besides John Evard, the senior vice president of tax, and Eric took the lead on building a world-class global planning team. Also then was involved in one of the largest spinoffs with Covidian in an inverted structure as well, and built out from the ground floor up a complete tax function there. And of course now has done the similar thing over at Fidelity. So one of the things I've always was amazed is Eric's ability to get along with people, not just in tax, but break these silos down, which, as he said, is so critical. I hope you guys paid close attention to that. It's one of the reasons people leave companies. And one of the reasons CFOs call me when they want to change heads of tax is the impression that clearly there's been silos created to the detriment of the shareholders. So his ability to get along there with the cross-functional people within the tax group and the external advisors has always amazed me. And I'm really, really appreciative of him taking the time. Eric, thank you so much. I think all the members here got a lot out of this.
Yep. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, everybody. We will meet up again. You'll get notifications on the next round. Tim McDonald from Procter & Gamble, the Senior VP of Tax there, will be doing the next session on external relationships. And then we'll have one more before we wrap it all up. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a great week.